I was only 25 when my parents slid a white envelope across the dinner table. My name was typed on the front like a bill from a stranger. Inside was a list that cut deeper than any argument. $2,500 a month for rent, utilities, and household costs. No warmth, no conversation, just numbers and late fees. Across from me, my sister Aspen twirled her pasta, her nails freshly polished, her phone glowing with some influencer video. She owed nothing, yet I was expected to carry everything. That night, the word family felt more like a transaction. I didn't know it then, but that envelope would change everything. Stay with me, because if you believe in justice and love powerful revenge stories, this one will leave you speechless. I had built my life around discipline. Every morning I woke up before sunrise, slipped into the stiff clothes of a bank teller, and plastered on a professional smile that hid how little sleep I got the night before. From 8 to 4, I counted other people's money, congratulated them on promotions, processed their loans, and politely nodded when they joked about saving for rainy days. What none of them knew was that when my shift ended, I didn't go home to rest. I clocked in at a small restaurant across town, trading a blazer for an apron, heels for sneakers, and polite nods for forced cheer. I carried trays until midnight, walked home with aching legs, and collapsed into the same childhood bedroom I had painted when I was 10 years old. That was my life. 2 jobs, no days off, and barely enough to breathe. I skipped breakfast more times than I could count, clipped coupons, and pretended granola bars were meals. Every dollar had a destination before it even touched my hands. Still, I believed it was worth it, because family was supposed to be the reason we worked this hard. Family, I thought, meant loyalty, support, and a sense of belonging. But that night at the dinner table shattered that illusion. My parents didn't see sacrifice. They saw a steady paycheck. They saw someone responsible enough to carry more weight. The irony was almost unbearable. I was called stable because I worked myself to exhaustion. I was called lucky because I didn't need rescuing. And Aspen, my younger sister, was excused because she was still figuring things out. Aspen had never worked a single double shift in her life. She floated through her 20s like every day was a casual Friday. She wore my old sweatshirts like they were her own, left lights blazing in empty rooms, and ordered Amazon packages she didn't even bother to pay for. When the bill arrived, it was my card that had been used. When I confronted her, she shrugged, as if borrowing from me was as natural as breathing. My mother's answer was even more painful. Why not support each other instead of keeping score? Support, in her eyes, meant me paying and Aspen consuming. The contrast gnawed at me. I came home to overdraft alerts and coupon-clipped groceries, while Aspen posed with ring lights and haul videos, her face glowing in the artificial brightness of a life I was subsidizing. She didn't flinch when she admitted to using my card. She didn't apologize. She didn't need to, because our parents had already built her an invisible safety net. She was the one who got grace. I was the one who got invoices. And still, I tried to convince myself that being the responsible one meant something. I told myself that one day they would see my sacrifices, that the sleepless nights and endless shifts would prove my worth, that the ledger of all I had given would balance out the silence I got in return. But the more I tried to justify it, the more I realized I wasn't being strengthened, I was being used. The rent demand was not just a bill. It was the loudest message my family had ever sent me. That love came with conditions, that loyalty had a price tag, and that fairness was never going to be part of the equation. They looked at Aspen and saw potential. They looked at me and saw utility. And as much as it broke me, I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. I was not their daughter in that moment. I was their safety net, their ATM, their silent provider. I folded that invoice carefully and walked upstairs, my chest heavy with a realization I didn't want to face. Family wasn't a shield for me. Family had become the burden I was carrying alone. And while Aspen laughed in the living room below, I sat staring at a spreadsheet on my laptop, trying to convince myself that numbers couldn't lie. But deep down, I already knew they had turned me into their ledger long before I had the chance to live my own life. The first week after that envelope landed in my lap, I tried to convince myself it was just another responsibility. I told myself that paying rent to my own parents might be a twisted lesson, but maybe it would make me stronger. Yet the truth unraveled quickly. Every bill they handed me came with the same cold precision typed invoices, due dates, and late fees like I was a tenant, not a daughter. Meanwhile, Aspen floated through the house like she owned it. Her room glowed with expensive ring lights, stacks of skincare products, and delivery boxes with my name on them but never my approval. She lived free of charge, and I lived under constant scrutiny. One Friday evening, exhausted after a double shift, I came home to find an Amazon package on the coffee table. My name was printed on the label, but I hadn't ordered anything. When I asked Aspen if she had used my card, she didn't even flinch. She smirked and said, "Well, you never changed the login." Like it was my fault she kept stealing. That moment stuck with me, not just because of the theft, but because of her complete lack of guilt. She didn't see it as stealing, she saw it as entitlement. And the worst part was my parents agreed. I confronted my mother that night, my voice trembling with fatigue and anger. "She's been charging my card for months," I said. My mom barely looked up from the sink, her tone flat and dismissive. "Aspen's still finding her path. You're the one with steady income. Why not support her instead of keeping score?" Those words sliced through me. Keeping score? Wasn't I allowed to notice when the scales had been so brutally tilted? My sacrifices were invisible. Her indulgence was excused, and my parents framed it all as balance. The bitterness began to seep into everything. At work, when I counted cash for customers or processed deposits, I couldn't help thinking of the money funneling straight into a household that drained me dry. At night, while my wrist ached from carrying trays, I scrolled through my bank statements, marking down charges that weren't mine: cosmetics, subscriptions, meal kits, all tied back to Aspen. I created a new spreadsheet tab labeled Aspen's Charges, color-coded in red. It was my silent rebellion, proof that I wasn't crazy, that my exhaustion had a name and a paper trail. But spreadsheets didn't ease the ache of betrayal. I began to notice the unspoken hierarchy in our house. Aspen got leniency, excuses, and sympathy. I got rules, invoices, and deadlines. If Aspen slept until noon, she was recovering. If I stayed out late after work, I was irresponsible. If Aspen wanted something, Mom would say, "We'll figure it out." If I needed help, Dad reminded me, "That's how the real world works." They called it parenting. To me, it felt like exploitation dressed up as life lessons. The conflict escalated the night I discovered the mortgage papers. A coworker at the bank casually showed me public records my parents were months behind on payments despite all the money I had been handing over. My stomach dropped. The rent I was paying wasn't teaching me responsibility. It was keeping their lights on. It wasn't about me growing, it was about them drowning. And they were perfectly fine letting me sink with them. I couldn't look at them the same after that. Every time my father dropped another envelope on the table, I saw manipulation, not guidance. Every time my mother defended Aspen's freeloading, I heard her say, "You don't matter as much." And every time Aspen twirled her hair and laughed from the couch, I felt the sting of injustice burn hotter in my chest. The late fees added insult to injury. $50 if you're late, my dad reminded me with that detached tone, as if he were a landlord protecting his bottom line. I wanted to scream that I hadn't had a day off in 6 months. That I lived in a room decorated with the same faded posters from middle school. That I had starved myself through lunch breaks just to keep my account from dipping into the red. But none of it mattered. They didn't see me as a daughter. They saw me as a resource. I began to realize the conflict wasn't just financial, it was emotional warfare. They had drawn the lines clearly. Aspen was the cherished dreamer, the one worth investing in. I was the workhorse, the one meant to shoulder responsibility without complaint. And the more I accepted their rules, the more they tightened the leash. But something shifted in me. I stopped seeing their words as authority and started seeing them as evidence. Every invoice, every charge, every dismissive comment was a receipt of betrayal. I wasn't powerless. I was documenting. And deep down, I knew that one day, these records wouldn't just sit in a folder, they would become the very tools I'd use to break free. The conflict in my family had reached its peak. It wasn't about love anymore. It was about control, favoritism, and survival. And while Aspen laughed and my parents preached responsibility, I quietly sharpened my resolve. They thought I was being shaped into a dutiful daughter. What they didn't realize was that they were forging someone ready to fight back. The day I discovered the truth, it didn't come as a scream. It arrived quietly, like a whisper slipping between the cracks of a normal afternoon. I was at the bank, balancing deposits behind the glass window, when Ezra, my coworker with the lazy grin and sharp eyes, leaned across the divider. He tapped a few keys, pulled up a public registry, and asked me if I wanted to see something interesting. What appeared on the screen made my stomach twist. My parents' mortgage account wasn't current. It wasn't even close. They were 90 days behind, teetering on the edge of foreclosure. For a long moment, I couldn't move. I thought of every envelope they'd slid across the dinner table. Every line item typed neatly into invoices that demanded I pay my share. I thought of all the nights I had collapsed into bed after double shifts, telling myself that this burden was teaching me strength, that maybe one day they would respect me for carrying so much. But now I knew the truth. The rent wasn't about teaching me discipline. It wasn't about responsibility or preparing me for the real world. It was about survival, their survival, and I was the lifeline they were too shameless to admit they needed. Ezra didn't sugarcoat it. "They're not teaching you anything," he said, his tone blunt. "They're keeping the lights on with your paycheck." The words landed like a stone in my chest. Suddenly, every late-night spreadsheet I had built, every overdraft alert, every ache in my legs from carrying trays until midnight, it all rearranged itself into a pattern I could no longer ignore. They weren't just unfair. They were using me. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, laptop open, staring at the columns of numbers I had tracked with meticulous care. Green for confirmed payments, yellow for disputes, red for Aspen's charges. Now I added another column: mortgage contributions. In bold letters, I typed, "This isn't about helping me grow. This is about keeping them from drowning." And for the first time, instead of feeling crushed by the weight of those words, I felt something else. Clarity. If they could treat me like a tenant, then I could treat this entire situation like a business. I would stop being the silent provider. I would start being the architect of my own exit. The first step was secrecy. I opened a high-yield savings account during my lunch break at a credit union across town, far enough that no one from my branch would notice. I used my work email, created a new PO, box for correspondence, and deposited the small bonus I had earned from quarterly targets. It was only $1,000, but it felt like the first brick in a wall I was finally building for myself. Then came the plan. I called it Operation Exit. Each night, while the rest of the house moved in its usual rhythm, Aspen's laughter drifting from her glowing bedroom, my mother humming in the kitchen, My father watching television like nothing in the world could touch him. I began packing, quietly, deliberately. A box of books slid into my trunk. A few clothes folded neatly into a bag. My sketch pads, hidden between stacks of old paperwork, carried out during lunch breaks. I drove them to a rented storage unit, one trip at a time. Nobody noticed. Nobody asked. They were too busy assuming I would always be there. Ezra became my confidant. Over stale sandwiches in the break room, he nudged me toward possibilities I had never let myself imagine. One afternoon, he slid his phone across the table, showing me a listing for a foreclosed three-bedroom house priced well below market value. Hardwood floors, clean windows, even a backyard. Not glamorous, but real. Possible. You've been saving, he said. Maybe not today, but sooner than you think. The idea terrified me, but it also lit something inside me. For years, I had been pouring money into a house that wasn't mine. What if I put that energy into a home of my own? The next week, I reached out to Mrs. Vega, a longtime client at the bank and a semi-retired real estate agent. She met me at a corner cafe, her eyes kind but sharp. The kind of woman who had seen too much to be surprised by anything. When I told her I wanted to buy property discreetly, she didn't flinch. Instead, she pulled a notepad from her bag and began sketching out a plan. "We'll set up an LLC," she explained. "Your name won't appear on the purchase documents. The company will hold the deed. It'll give you privacy, and more importantly, protection." She asked me what name I wanted for the company. Without thinking, I scribbled the word Vanquish across the page. She smiled. Then it settled. Vanquish Properties, LLC. I didn't realize it then, but naming it was the moment I claimed my power back. Vanquish meant victory. It meant overcoming. It meant ending something that had weighed on me for too long. The paperwork moved faster than I expected. Ezra helped me draft financials. Mrs. Vega handled the filings. By the following week, I held a folder with my company's name on the cover and a checklist titled Operation Exit. Each night, as I packed another box, I checked off a line, one more step away from the house that had never felt like home. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was planning. For the first time in my life, my exhaustion carried purpose. The girl who had been handed invoices like punishment was becoming a woman who could hold deeds in her hands. My family thought they had trapped me into obedience. What they didn't realize was that their greed had taught me to calculate, to document, to prepare. And now, I wasn't preparing for them. I was preparing to leave. The morning the letter arrived at my parents' house, I wasn't there to see it, but Mrs. Vega later told me exactly how it unfolded. My mother walked down the driveway, robe tied tight around her waist, expecting another bill or some coupon mailer. Instead, she pulled out an envelope stamped with the name of a company she had never heard of, Vanquish Properties, LLC. When she opened it, her face went pale. The mortgage on their home had been sold, and the new owner was listed in bold. That owner was me. By evening, they were at my door. I watched them through the peephole before I opened it. My father stood stiff, jaw tight, as if anger alone could intimidate me back into obedience. My mother wrung her hands, eyes darting nervously. And Aspen, standing behind them, wore sunglasses, even though the sun had set, arms crossed like a shield. "We got a letter," my mother began softly, as if a sweet tone could erase years of sharp-edged commands. "Some company took over the mortgage. We think there's been a mistake." "There hasn't," I said, voice calm, steady. My father's brow furrowed. "Do you know anything about Vanquish Properties?" "I do." The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. They had expected excuses, maybe confusion, not certainty. My mother shifted, her voice trembling now. Sweetheart, Aspen will need a place to stay while we figure this out. Just temporarily. You've always been the responsible one. I tilted my head, studying the girl behind them who had drained my accounts, and laughed about it. Then I answered with a precision they should have recognized it was their own language thrown back at them. Garage couch. $2,500 a month. Late fees apply. Aspen's sunglasses slipped as her mouth fell open. Are you serious? Dead serious, I replied. You taught me well. My father's face turned red, veins pulsing at his temples. This isn't a game, Latrice. We're your family. I stepped closer to the threshold. So were you, when you handed me a typed invoice and called it love. My mother's voice cracked, almost a whisper. We didn't mean to. Yes, you did, I cut in. You meant every word. You meant every late fee. And I learned. I closed the door before they could say another word. Their muffled voices lingered on the other side. No shouting, no banging, just the hollow sound of people who realized control had slipped through their fingers. But that wasn't the last time they came. Days later, they returned, standing on the porch as if waiting for permission. I let them in and led them to the kitchen where I had already arranged 3 chairs and placed a manila envelope on the table. They sat hesitantly, like visitors in a stranger's house. I slid the envelope toward them. Inside were 2 years of records, every rent payment, every utility split, every grocery receipt, every unauthorized credit card charge under Aspen's name. Page after page, organized, documented, undeniable. They flipped through in silence until my father reached the last page, the property deed, signed and notarized. His voice broke flatly. This is real. It's the deed to your house, I confirmed. Vanquish Properties owns it now. His hand shook as he scanned the page again, as though hoping the ink might rearrange itself into something less damning. But how? You gave me an education, I said, and I put it to use. He slumped back in the chair, shoulders sagging like a man who finally understood the cost of his own cruelty. My mother reached across the table, her fingers trembling. Latrice, please. The mortgage is under a legal entity, I said evenly. You'll receive a new payment schedule next week. If you want to negotiate, use the email listed in the letter you received. I walked them to the door, watching as they stepped outside with the envelope clutched tightly. Aspen stayed silent, her face pale beneath the bravado. Before shutting the door, I handed the folder back to my mother. You'll need this. It's everything you taught me. When the door clicked shut, the silence that filled my home wasn't empty. It was earned. For years, I had been their resource, their silent provider, their invisible backbone. Now, I was the owner of the very ground they stood on. Justice didn't come with a grand explosion. It came with documents, signatures, and the calm certainty of knowing the balance had finally shifted. They had turned me into their ledger, but I had rewritten the story. The invoices they used to control me had transformed into receipts of my victory. I no longer needed their approval. I no longer needed their validation. What I had now was something better: freedom, peace, and the power to set the rules on my own terms. And for the first time in my life, the weight pressing down on my chest lifted. I could breathe. In the quiet of my new home, sunlight poured across a half-finished canvas, and for the first time, I understood what freedom felt like. This wasn't revenge, it was reclamation. My parents had handed me invoices like chains, but I turned those chains into keys. They tried to bury me under responsibility, yet I built a foundation strong enough to walk away. What once felt like scarcity had become abundance, not because they gave it to me, but because I claimed it for myself. Their betrayal no longer defined me, it fueled me, and as I stood in that silence, I realized the sweetest victory wasn't punishing them, but finally belonging to myself. I'd love to know your thoughts. If your own family tried to break you this way, how would you respond? Share your story in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe, like, and share for more pain files.